Thank you to my colleagues that showed up here. So I am not talking to myself because I totally would have done it just to have the recording. And I know some of you already heard some of this, but this is going to be more coherent story of experience of late stage USSR that led up to the current situation that we're in and to my current situation personally, really. Just reference this QR code, that's to my link tree, where I have two relevant documents. One of the relevant documents is a set of links with information on current situation in Ukraine and various ways that people can help with current situation, but also mostly really information, backstory, explanations of propaganda, etc. And another document is the background for this talk, various timelines, history, academic documents on the relevant things to what I am discussing. This talk is not truly an academic talk. I am not going to be talking about research, though I am offering you research through here to back up what I'm talking about. I'm going to be primarily talking about it through the lens of personal experience of this time. However, we are going to have to start with history because in all my time of living in the United States, the more I talk to people about being from the former USSR, being specifically from Ukraine, a lot of people really don't have this contextual understanding of what that was when it started. I originally created this presentation for high school students when my own children were in high school and they were taking US history or world history, and I realized that there was very little context given to Cold War and to what Soviet Union is or have been. And I felt that it was necessary to provide this constant context if I could. So here we are. One thing I discovered is, for example, American school children, and I am hoping it's different for college students, but American school children, when they're taught the history about the USSR sort of magically comes into being. The Russian Empire is not discussed very much. How Russian Revolution happened and why it's not discussed very much. The fact that there were actually several revolutions is not discussed. What happened in all the various parts of the country is not discussed. And so suddenly you have the Soviet Union and suddenly it becomes evil, as if it's just how it was supposed to be, which is not really the case. So what is the case? Well, this is the Russian Empire pre-1917. It's gigantic. And the territory you are looking at is the territory of current Russia and former Soviet Union, but it's also a territory of several countries that are not and have not been parts of the Soviet Union or parts of Russia subsequently. For example, most of Finland was in Russian Empire. Poland did not exist as a country at that point. Most of what is now Poland was part of the Russian Empire, and some of it was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was all broken up. And obviously, a lot of these now independent Soviet republics in Central Asia, in the Caucasian Mountains, in the Baltics, all of those places were parts of the Russian Empire. Something that I don't really see acknowledged very much, and certainly never acknowledged in Russia, is that Russian Empire was a major colonial power. They claim that they haven't been because they don't have outside colonies. I mean, they tried. They tried to have a colony in California, and they certainly tried in Alaska, but really they ended up not, and everything's part of their normal territory, except, of course, they have colonized all of Siberia, which had people in it, the indigenous populations that were living there, and Russia has colonized it, and they have colonized even initially where the whole thing started in Kiev and Rus, where Kiev now is, which is part of Ukraine, where Moscow is, there were non-Slavic tribes living there. So they colonized from the very beginning and continued expanding everywhere and absorbing these territories. And generally speaking, the ways that people in these different territories were treated kind of varied. But people in power were almost universally either Russian people or occasionally people from like the nobility of the local territories, if such existed. But in 1917, there was a situation which, as a student who formerly was educated in the Soviet educational system, I was taught all of the Lenin's writings and descriptions for why the revolution happened, right? And we had to read and make notes and all that, and it still stuck with me to this day. Those of you in sociology probably will appreciate. There was a revolutionary situation. And the revolutionary situation was described as the top can't and the bottom doesn't want to anymore. And that meant that the people who were in power didn't know how to handle the difficulties, and the people on the bottom couldn't and didn't want to put up with the difficulties that existed in the country at that point. And so it kind of blew up. And it blew up more than once. There was sort of a revolution that wasn't fully successful in 1905. And then in 1917, in February, there was a revolution that overthrew the absolute monarchy that existed in Russia at the same time and created sort of a limited monarchy with a democratic government. But at the time when this happened, the Bolsheviks, Lenin and his cohorts were really removed from the center of events. Lenin was at the time in exile. And so all this fomenting of the proletariat revolution driven by Marxism, these people were not on site when February Revolution happened, but they came back. And when they came back, they were able to organize the October Revolution, which technically now is in November because the calendar was different. And these are images from that. And that then finally overthrew then democratic government, which was admittedly limitedly democratic, and eventually destroyed monarchy altogether. The immediate result of that, now this was all happening during World War I. Right, so when this is all happening, the reason of the economic crisis, of course, is Russia's at war. There is lots of issues and problems created by that. So the whole country kind of fell apart into pieces. Having lived through the country falling apart into pieces again in 1990, I imagine this was not a pleasant experience for anyone. But there were a lot of people who were hopeful, which also was true in 1990, where a lot of people were hopeful. And a lot of people were on board with this. But it took 5 years to get to the point where most of these broken apart sub-countries, subdivisions of the Russian Empire that were originally let go of during the revolution were persuaded to join back up again. And the documents were signed in 1922, creating Soviet Union. Now, in the Marxist-Leninist theory at the time, there was a belief, and Lenin subscribed to that belief, that you cannot build communism and proper socialism even unless you convert the whole world. Because, of course, the idea of communism is there is no state, right? So you had to have everybody be on board because you cannot have states in that situation. Stalin, who eventually took over, did not subscribe to that idea, and he thought we could do it just in this one country and make that happen. So he proceeded with that. And so once they formed the SSR, Lenin at the time was already not doing well. He has been shot. He had also other illnesses. And so in 1944, Stalin succeeds Lenin. At first, it wasn't by himself. It was like as a group, part of a group of people, but he ended up taking over, of course, all the power. And he started creating sort of mythology of being true a descendant of Lenin and true kind of follower in Lenin's footsteps, including with images like this, which even in the technology at the time they were able to create, this is fake. They were never friendly. They never got along. Lenin tolerated a lot of dissent and disagreement within the party. He argued against those people and tried to persuade them out of power and get them out of power, but was not as oppressive as Stalin ended up being, where eventually he would pretty much murder everybody who was part of his original coalition because he wanted to be in power by himself. And I'm not going to dwell too much on Stalin and Stalin's repressions. That generally is pretty well known, what Stalin did and how he acted. But then we have this like border of 1941, and growing up as a child, for me, there was always like this idea there was life before and life after. And it's interesting because I'm now hearing people from Ukraine talk about it like that, who are refugees. And they're saying there's always going to be before and after. Before February 24th and after. And in USSR, it was before June 22nd, 1941, and after June 22nd, 1941. But of course, the World War already was raging in Europe up to that point. It's just that Soviet Union wasn't involved. And Soviet Union wasn't involved because Stalin made a deal with Hitler. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed several years before, and in that pact, they have divided the parts of Europe that were in between then Germany and Soviet Union, and who got what was determined. And so USSR got big chunks of former Russian Empire back, which meant Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, it meant the Baltics, it meant various other bits of territory. So again, kind of when people have conversations about was Ukraine ever a country and why should it be its own country, it was not, because it was always fought over and parceled by these powers. And so this happens and it becomes all like a republic under Soviet Union in 1939. And of course, 2 years later, Germans break the pact and enter the territory of the Soviet Union. And the way they did it was by bombing Kiev at 4 a.m. There is a song about it that was written that July of 1941, which has been kind of playing in my head on and off over the last month, because it's just eerily similar to what the Russians did in February. They did it at 5 a.m., big difference, but basically middle of the night attack without expectation and so on. With massed forces before, where everybody was kind of suspecting, but people kept saying, no, nothing will happen. It will be fine, it makes no sense. And then, of course, everybody gets involved with this. There is a victory. The victory in Great Patriotic War in Soviet Union is celebrated on May 9th. It was like the biggest holiday. That versus like the Revolution Day, November 7th. Those were like always parades, always big parties. You had veterans come over, speak in schools, all of that. And it almost felt like the Soviet Union, to me, growing up, I did not even think of it as World War. Nobody did. It was always like our war, our patriotic war, were the ones fought it, which made sense, really, because I grew up in a city that used to be occupied during the war. And my grandfather fought in the war, and my grandmother and my other grandparents, they were refugees during the war. And my father was born in evacuation during the war. So all of that was like, this is ours, this affected our family, this was fought on the land that I'm going to school in and live, and all of that's happening, right? So the point is, like, Soviet people were sort of taking ownership of that victory, but it was the Soviet people, and that's important. It was all of the Soviet people, though pretty much all of territory of Ukraine was occupied and was fought over, and territory of Belarus. Small portions of Russian territory were occupied, but like all of that vast east of Russia was not. And it's interesting because Russians are now presenting themselves as the liberators of everybody and as the only people who fought, which particularly ironic to me when I think about my great uncle, whose real name was Urum, but who went by Sasha eventually, who was Turkmenian. And during the war, he ran away. He was 15. He was an orphan, and he was basically assistant shepherd and was living with other shepherds in Turkmenistan. And he ran away to join the war. And he pretty much followed like a battle unit, participating in everything all the way to Berlin. And it was his war. He was not Russian, right? And so excluding them and saying that it was all Russian is kind of odd. But when Cold War began, there was a Russian scare, right? It was people were talking about the Russians. People were not talking here, as far as I can tell. Now you guys can tell me, because certainly many of you are old enough to remember, right? People were talking about the Russians doing all these things. And so it already became kind of codified in the West that this conflict, the disagreement between Soviet Union and the West, that it was all coming from Russia. And then, of course, Stalin died, but after Stalin died, there was a lot of mess and a lot of attempts to rewrite history. This is a poster from 1954, so like the year after Stalin died. And on this poster, it says, "Under the flag of Lenin Stalin," hyphenated as if they're a married couple. "Under the leadership of the Communist Party, forward to the triumph of communism." And the other banner says, "Glory to the great Soviet people, builders of communism." This is actually important because in the West during the Cold War, and even now, people keep talking about USSR as a communist country. Union of Soviet and Socialist Republics is not a communist country. By definition, it was a socialist country. We can quibble whether it was real socialism. But living there, we didn't think it was communist. We knew we were doing this. We knew we were building communism. Except, of course, at the point of my life, Stalin was dropped from this equation because by 1957, when Khrushchev took power, Stalin was exposed for all the evil things that have been done and was no longer sort of in vogue and talked about. And then, of course, we have Khrushchev, who did not bank his show on as advertised, but did have his show off and on his desk as pictured. And then Khrushchev gets deposed because he wasn't doing the right things from the point of view of other people. But in 1961 is when we have more of the division, kind of escalation of Cold War tension. So the Berlin Wall is built. This is people escaping the apartments that are literally on the border. So this 77-year-old woman is trying to go to the West Berlin because her apartment is in East Berlin, but the street is in the West. And the people initially, the wall was not very big and people could still communicate and interact. And then, of course, it got bigger and better, I guess. And so just highlights of all of that, right? We have the Cuban Missile Crisis, so things keep getting worse and things keep getting scarier. And in 1964, the Communist Party leadership decides that Khrushchev is not handling any of this correctly. He gets kicked out, and Leonid Brezhnev takes over. Interestingly, Brezhnev was from Ukraine. And then 1971 is when I happened. So all of this was, I said personal context, right? And all of this, and I wasn't even around for it, right? So the significant events for this story is 1971. But to me, this all matters because all of my childhood, right, Brezhnev was in charge, and this conception of Brezhnev is who is keeping us from actual nuclear Armageddon was very significant for my own personal development and experience. So what was a childhood like? Generally speaking, when people realize that I'm critical of Soviet Union, they're like, so you had like bad childhood, you had a bad life, and I go, no, I had a good childhood. So how are you critical? What does this mean to be critical of Soviet Union and the lives there and Soviet Union as a country, and to say, but my childhood was fine, because my childhood was an illusion. My childhood was an illusion largely created by my parents who sheltered me from a lot of problematic effects and difficulties that existed in the Soviet Union. And they raised me to be a true believer. They did it on purpose. Now, I know we're recording, but the people who are actually in the audience, you guys know me. And you know that I say things. When I think something needs to be said, I will say it. When I think it's the truth or something needs to be argued about, I will argue about it. I was always like that since I was a little child. My parents knew I was like that, and they tried to make me not be like that, and they failed. So this is kind of like the personality that I was born with, in a sense, because they really tried to change it. So their solution to not being arrested, basically, because their child is trying to denounce Soviet Union in school, was to make sure that their child believed in Soviet Union being a good thing. So that's how I ended up being a believer in reality of USSR that was really only paper thin. So for example, the pictures here are various preschool/kindergarten celebrations. And this picture has different children who were all children in Ukraine. This is a celebration of October Revolution. This is Chrysler Aurora, this sort of model of this boat that did the first shot of the October Revolution, the actual communist revolution. We're all wearing sort of stylized national costumes from different republics of the USSR. This one's Georgian, well, was supposed to be anyway. Kind of actually is, it's just like the dress would be longer. It's indecent what I was wearing here. And we perform like dances in this, that we were taught all these different national dances. It's kind of interesting to me because when I talked to my daughter's high school class, the history teacher said that she was showing them earlier a document for how during the Cold War they identified communist sympathizers. Apparently, interest in folk dancing was a sign that you were a communist sympathizer, because folk dancing was very big in the USSR. At some point when I was older, I wanted to join like a folk dancing class or group, and I auditioned and I was kicked out because I was not watching the teacher enough and I was watching other people. So I was considered unfit for a folk dancing. I was always very sad about that. But this, I believed that we had this like true union and true expression of all these cultures, and everybody had freedom to express them. Because where I lived, we weren't really talking much about various suppressions and deportations and so on that happened during Stalin and then kind of continued to happen in different places. We weren't talking about large import of Russian speakers into Moldova, for example, once Moldova was taken into the Soviet Union to basically change the culture of the place. And the same in other territories, to Russify and control those territories. But here we were celebrating the cultures. Those are New Year celebrations. New Year was a really big holiday there because back in the 30s, during the time when Soviet Union was really suppressing religion of all kinds. Soviet Union was also getting rid of all the religious holidays, obviously, so you didn't have any public celebrations of Christmas, Easter, or anything. And at some point, the higher-ups decided that it was sort of sad that the Soviet children didn't have like parties with presents in winter and all of these like secular aspects of Christmas that other kids had, so they decided to bring that all back for New Year, which really presents were already for New Year in the Russian Empire. That was kind of how the tradition developed. So we had the tree for New Year, and this is a snow maiden. She's a part of the mythology of that, and so you had kids, you had to perform. You didn't get presents for free, so if you were like at an event with Grandpa Frost, like here you go to Santa and Santa just gives you something. Yeah, no, you had to perform. Nothing was free there. So we had to perform and then we were given presents. And you had to like it because there weren't any other presents. So this is kind of, I showed this picture to my daughter a long time ago and she's like, are you always this depressed? And I was like, well, no, but also you weren't really like you weren't supposed to be smiley. So again, different cultural environments, so smiling was not something like you did a whole lot, even when you were pleased. But I was always a fairly like serious child. I was bookish, and I did always have this sort of sad thing. But also, if you look at Soviet pictures and you see Jewish children or not Jewish children all look more like this. There is a lot more sad. And now I have this idea of generational trauma and effect because one of the reasons that my parents were doing what they were doing, one thing they didn't want me to know about when I was little was anti-Semitism. because we were Jewish. And in Soviet Union, Judaism had nothing to do with religion at this point because nobody was supposed to have any religion. It was ethnicity. So, of course, not all Jews within the Soviet Union territory were Ashkenazi, but pretty much all of the ones in Ukraine, except very small portion in Crimea, have been. So it was like an ethnic identification. And in Soviet Union, you were always, wherever you went, whatever paperwork you filled out, whatever documents you received, you were always labeled by your ethnic group. So people who were actually Georgian, from Georgia, they would say Georgian on their paperwork. People who were Armenian, it would say Armenian. Ukrainians would say Ukrainian. Russians would say Russian. So all of us were in Ukraine, but only some of us were Ukrainian on paper, on their paperwork, because those would be people who were ethnically descendant from Ukrainian parentage. Right? And my paperwork said that I was Jewish, because both of my parents have been Jewish. And if both of your parents were of the same ethnic group when you were born, there was only one option for your birth certificate. If they were different, they could choose. And most smart Jewish parents, if they could, they chose to put something other than Ukrainian on their kids' paperwork. My parents didn't have that option. My parents' close friends did, but the father was entirely too proud. So he insisted on his son being given his last name, which was a Jewish last name, Spiegelman, instead of his wife's last name, Beleshov, and to be identified as Jewish. And of course, later on, when that son wanted to go to a medical institute, which is how you became a doctor over there, that posed a problem because there were quotas. So these identifications all came with how many of these people we want in these professions or these fields. They were not officially recorded, so to say, but they were nevertheless government-driven. They were state-driven. So you knew that there were certain things like you couldn't study if you were Jewish unless you bribed somebody or if you had connections. So at the point when I was in high school and I wanted to study psychology, that was not actually an option for me because that would have to be in a big state university and I was too provincial without connections and too Jewish. So that was not a path that I could follow, which is why I ended up following it here. So, but there was a lot of this, like we did some things that I wasn't supposed to talk to my friends about, really. Like we celebrated some of the Jewish holidays. But I always thought Passover was just one day, and then you just ate matzah until it ran out. Because we had to buy matzah from Odessa. You couldn't buy it in my town. There was no synagogues. There wasn't any kind of like official Jewish life. There was some in Odessa. So we had to bring it in, and then whatever we had, we just ate. But we also ate other things, right? We didn't follow religious practices. And we weren't supposed to discuss it. But at about this age, I was standing in a circle with friends of mine, kindergarten. I think one of them I have pictured on the next picture. And we, for some reason, were telling each other what our nationality was. So they didn't call it ethnicity, they actually called it nationality over there, but they meant ethnicity. And people went in a circle saying Russian and Ukrainian pretty much because that's what everybody in that circle was, and it gets to me. And I say I'm Jewish. And then my good friend Alona says to me, oh, but my mom said that there was this man who wrote a book and it said that all Jewish people are evil. So, with my later understanding, right, her mother was trying to explain Hitler badly. And, but the way that my friend said it to me was very upsetting at the point, and I came home and I cried to my mother, and then my mother called her mother and they cleared it up. They were not actually meaning it that way, but this is how I first found out. Because my parents didn't want to tell me. Because my parents didn't want me to know. My parents wanted to create an illusion as long as possible that everything was just like perfectly fine. And we're living in this multi-ethnic paradise. This is, I don't even remember, but I think it's Estonian costume. It's one of the Baltic countries that this May 1st celebration entailed. This is me like at about 6. This is still, you started school at 7, so this is like last year of kindergarten. It was multi-year process. And this is us celebrating. Incidentally, it's a sort of a relevant aside for those of you who know that I have a fainting condition. A rehearsal for this event is when I did it for the first time, right from here onto the back row. This created big problems, though it kind of is also relevant because a lot of Soviet assemblies later on involved a lot of standing sort of at attention and listening to various like speakers and pronouncements or being prettily dressed up for decoration. It did not go well for me most of the time. And you didn't really have an excuse to not be there. But Soviet Union maintained this sort of veneer of everything's great. And we're like the greatest country, and everybody's get along, and look at all these cultures. They're all unified, right? And so you see all these postcards for different holidays. This is International Women's Day, was a big holiday in the USSR. It was kind of like well, largely it was like Valentine's Day. You basically gave presents to all the women indiscriminately in this regard. So it wasn't very much about accomplishments. But these are all like Russian dolls, but in different costumes of the 15 republics. And these are all people in different costumes of the 15 republic. This March 8th one shows some of the indigenous people of Siberia, again in celebration of that. But if you look at these cards here, who is at the front? This, and this, and this. It's all Russian. It's always Russian. And the Soviet hymn says the union of 15 republics is created by the great Russia. So even though there was this illusion of we have a union, it was really all about Russia. I think I did the sound wrong. So it was all about the great party. I'm pretty sure that it's one of the choirs. This might be, I think there are women's voices in this, so it's not the army choir. So it's interesting to me because over here, school teachers and we professors are often accused of indoctrinating the young people, right? And we always say if we could indoctrinate them, wouldn't we first get them to actually read the syllabus? Never works, right? But over there, they were definitely doing that. And again, depending on what people's life was at home and what their parents were saying, the degree to which kids actually accepted and believed it was different. Because my parents kept me in the dark about like pretty much everything, I was a much bigger believer in everything that was going on than was actually typical at that point. At that point, a lot of people were becoming disillusioned because we were in a period economically that's known as stagnation or the Stoy period. Brezhnev was not an effective leader. The centralized economy of the Soviet Union was really not doing that great. There was constant deficit of things. You could not really buy like consumer goods. My grandfather was in line for a car for 20 years. At some point, I wanted to learn how to ride a bicycle. And spoiler, I don't know how to ride a bicycle at this point. And that's because when I was a kid, my parents said, well, we have to sign up to wait in line to get a bicycle. You basically subscribed to it, and when it was your turn, your bicycle was available to you. And they said, we're not sure, you're just like not very athletic. I was wimpy. And they said, well, try with your neighbor bicycle, see if you like it. And then if you like it, we will sign up and we will get a bicycle. So I broke my neighbor's, my girlfriend's bicycle because I was not good at it. And the way I fell, it got like twisted into a pretzel. The Soviet consumer goods were not quality made. in most cases. And so they had to get in line and buy her a bicycle, basically. So that was that. I didn't have a bicycle. I didn't learn. I tried to learn as an adult. But it turns out if you learn as an adult and then you stop, then you don't actually learn it forever. So starting school at 7, you started always on September 1st. And an interesting thing, of course, about Soviet school is that you went through school for 8 years with the same, like, 35 people that you started with. Obviously, somebody would move schools or something, but generally speaking, these were your classmates permanently. You had no assignments to different classes. You always went to scheduled classes together. And you had a class record book. And a class record book had everybody's grades, everybody's address, and, once again, everybody's nationality. So you knew everything about everybody in that situation. Nothing was particularly secret. But beginning in 1st grade, my parents told me that I had to get a gold medal. A gold medal was like an accomplishment that I think is kind of comparable to being a valedictorian, but not exactly the same. It basically meant you had straight A's in high school. But my parents, once again, lied to me and told me I had to have straight A's always, because they knew that's how you get to straight A's in high school, right? So they persuaded me that I had to have good grades everywhere. And for some reason, when I was 7, I wanted that gold medal. I did end up getting it. But the reason they wanted me to have it is that if you had a gold medal, it simplified admissions into higher education, because Soviet Union had high school exit exams and it had college entrance exams. And the entrance exams were like, first you would take a subject exam that was actually written for whatever like subject was most relevant to your major. So in the end, for me, it ended up being a math test. And then you had to take multiple other exams, and most of those exams would be oral, where you would directly interact with the examiner. You would like pull out a ticket with the questions you answer, and it was very easy to fail you. They did not want me, as a Jewish child, to be facing those exams. And they wanted me to have a gold medal, because with a gold medal, if you got an equivalent of an A on the first exam, you got in. And that usually was written and much more difficult to fail you intentionally. Nobody told me that at the time, right? They just pretty much got me motivated enough that they just like wanted it, and then I was just going on at a pilot. I just had to have the grades, and I got competitive. So that was, no longer a problem. But also, in order to make it easier for me, they had me exempt from the Ukrainian language. And so this brings us to the current situation of Ukraine and the Russian speakers of Ukraine. Where I come from is called Mykolaiv. It's a city in southern Ukraine. It's because everybody is hearing about all the battles, it's between Kherson and Odessa. Kherson is currently the closest big city to Crimea, which is how they took it. And Mykolaiv is kind of next. And in order to get to Odessa from Crimea, you have to go through Mykolaiv, because there is a river. There is not, the bridges are there. There is no other way to get there except from like the other side. And they very hard have been trying to take Mykolaiv currently. So Mykolaiv, like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, is a city of Russian speakers. The reason Mykolaiv is a city of Russian speakers is partially historical. When it was originally built, it was during Catherine the Great time. And Potemkin imported a bunch of serfs there to start shipbuilding industry. So it was a shipbuilding city. I know I'm not saying the word ship right, but not the little woolly ones, but the ones on the ocean. So it was a shipbuilding industry city. And initially, they imported the serfs, then they imported some wives for them. That's a whole separate ridiculous story how that happened. But the government, the oversight and everything of the city was always Russian. The countryside was fairly Ukrainian and Ukrainian speaking. But cities like Mykolaiv, like Kherson, like Odessa, they were kind of artificial creations of the empire. And as artificial creations of the empire, they were populated by imperial exports. And that's what made them partially at least Russian-speaking. But being in Ukraine, they had a large influx of Ukrainian population over time. They were also not within what's known as the Pale of Settlement, which during the Russian Empire was where you were supposed to only live if you were Jewish. And the only way out was if you had a certain profession or a lot of money and could start a business, which is also why Jewish parents always pushed education. You just kind of had to. You couldn't get out otherwise. But you could have exceptions. But the population of Jewish people in my town was always limited. So I was always like one, maybe two in a class, or sometimes in a whole school when I was there. And my parents exempt me from Ukrainian because you could do that if your child was frequently ill, which I was. I was a properly sickly child as a child. And so for like my well-being, I was not required to take it. Because everything, all the business, or everything was conducted in Ukrainian, in Russian there, but there were a lot of books, especially translations of foreign works, that were published in Ukrainian and not in Russian. And when I was a kid, I really wanted to read like fiction, stories. And to do that, I taught myself Ukrainian. I taught myself to read in Ukrainian. It's close enough to Russian that I was able to do that. I could never like speak it properly with good pronunciation, but it's a little bit funny because my Russian accent is actually a Ukrainian accent. Because the ways that people pronounce certain sounds where I came from, even if they spoke Russian, was the Ukrainian accented way. So I always had to, if I did like stage performances, I did a lot of theater. When I was younger, I had to correct for Ukrainian sounds in Russian speaking. So again, more multiculturalism. That's a Turkmenian costume supervised by my uncle. Made for New Year, my first celebrations, and lots of veneration of Lenin going on throughout this time. But here's another reason for you why Soviet children look depressed. Some of the cartoons that we watched, like, were very different. And again, I had my kids watch them, and then my daughter got older, and she started questioning some of this and going like, do you realize that this dog is suicidal? Like, he actually kills himself in this cartoon, and everybody's okay with that? And I'm like, yeah, now that you mention it. And this hedgehog in the fog, he's having like an existential crisis. It's like the Russian cartoon classic. All of these, by the way, like they are all on YouTube. You can watch them. And so I was like, oh, no, they're not like, there's not always a happy end. There is a lot more brooding and deep, and like bad things happen and people are just like moving on. And that's kind of the attitude. You always expect bad things to happen. And if the bad things don't happen, well, that's great. They always like, I expect this bad thing will happen, and I am okay with being wrong. Like if it doesn't, actually. But like one of my motivations for learning Ukrainian was I wanted to read The Three Musketeers because I watched the movie of Three Musketeers. It's a Russian movie, it's a musical, and it's mostly filmed in Odessa and Lviv in Ukraine because those were more European-looking cities. I did not know this as a child, and that's the reason I always wanted to go to Paris all my life was this movie. And like lots of other French literature and so on. And I didn't realize that the Paris I saw in the movie was not the actual Paris. It was Odessa, Paris. It created an illusion. But a lot of these were like this crocodile, Gena, and Cheburashka. Cheburashka was the most famous Russian cartoon character. He's basically an abandoned, unknown animal that lives in a phone booth, kind of homeless in the Soviet Union. And this crocodile works in a zoo as a crocodile. That's his day job. He lives in an apartment, but he works in a zoo as a crocodile. So somehow it made sense to me as a child, okay? And this however, is I have this here. This is a sort of like a Soviet cult classic, 17 Moments of Spring. It's a story of a spy, a Soviet spy deeply embedded into the German apparatus of, government. And so he's hanging out with all the higher ups, but he is actually sending information to the Soviet Union and all that. And everybody was obsessed with this. It was a movie, but it was made over like multiple episodes, so you could only watch it on TV. You know. This one we always watched on New Year, and we still do. There is this weirdness of processing the Soviet experience today as ex-Soviet adults, and people are saying, do you identify as Russian or Ukrainian or what? And most often, I really identify as ex-Soviet. And one of the papers I actually have in a collection they created is about that, especially about immigrant Jewish people who are from former USSR, especially like the last wave where we came. They don't really identify with like Judaism the same way as Americans do, and they don't identify as being Russian or Ukrainian or anything. They really identify as the product of that time, of that era, of these things that we all kind of have in common and share, which is why it is so painful to kind of experience what's happening now, because we all have shared culture, so how are people doing this to each other like that and denying it to others? But at the same time, I had a friend of mine who is like ethnic Ukrainian say to me today, I posted something on Facebook where I added an explanation that, but I'm not ethnically Ukrainian, that's just how I feel. And she's like, oh no, today in Ukraine, the ethnicity and ethnic origin has nothing to do with who is Ukrainian anymore. And that is true. This has changed. So it's kind of really interesting to me that in Soviet Union, in that context where we were told that we're all one people, but like we are all these different ethnicities and we're supposed to acknowledge which ethnicities we are all the time, we were all separate and I couldn't be treated as Ukrainian. I couldn't say I was Ukrainian back then. It wouldn't be accepted, it would be a lie. In fact, when somebody who was like recognizably Jewish on their face and by their name claimed that they were Ukrainian, other people looked at them with derision because it was like you're hiding, right? And so I still have that remnant mentality of that, but I dressed like this for the past month. I now own a lot of blue and yellow things, more than I did before. And that's like my own constant rally. Some of you have noticed that, right? So, and that's because I do feel Ukrainian now. I feel a lot more connection to Ukraine than I did when I lived in Ukraine, and that is really weird, yes. And it happened, it's a creation of today's time. It's not a creation of even my experience. And it's not just me. There are articles and articles now written on immigrants from Ukraine who in fact escaped from Ukraine because they had problems like anti-Semitism or something else, now having a lot of connection to it. So 1982, Brezhnev died. This is like frozen in time flashbulb for me, standing in the back of my classroom with other people, like when we found out, and like crying because we thought, we were sure, there was going to be immediate nuclear war. We were thinking that that's like, that we had Brezhnev, that was the only thing that was keeping Americans from attacking us, and it would immediately happen. And of course, Yuri Andropov got put in charge, and Andropov was very, I think you say bullish here, like he was very gung-ho on resisting American influence and being a nuclear power, and he was a big believer that Americans were going to start it. So it really got worse in all respects, and again, most of you should be able to remember this here, what that was like. So in 1983, of course, that's like a year into Andropov being in charge, Reagan gives this speech where he calls the USSR empire of evil. And there is a whole timeline of this conflict where both sides keep escalating and escalating, and things get kind of scary and scarier, no matter where you live. I think here and there, everybody was probably significantly concerned that something was going to happen. So 1983, Time Cover has the two of them as Men of the Year because that was all about the conflict that they were escalating between each other. But then, of course, Andropov died. Andropov didn't just do that. He also completely attempted to make Russians and the whole of Soviet Union really less alcoholic. So he instituted major restrictions on alcohol sales and productions in the territories of the USSR. So you could only buy so much, and you could only buy it at certain times. And the result was that they started drinking everything. So people invented extracting alcohol out of toothpaste, especially like in the military. Basically, you have like black bread and you put toothpaste on it. I don't know American toothpaste works the same way, but Soviet toothpaste did. And you basically let it sit there and you scrape off the toothpaste and the bread would have alcohol. So people did that. People drank cologne. People installed later on, because after effects remained even after he died, stills. My grandmother at some point had a still in her bathtub. She made alcohol. From sugar, you had to have special tickets to get sugar because everybody wanted sugar at that point. And that was currency. It wasn't because we were alcoholics, but because you could use alcohol to trade for other things, like, for example, meat for your family or medications that you could not get otherwise. So this was kind of an effect, like making the deficit economy even more of a deficit economy. And then, of course, there was another leader after that who also dropped dead very quickly. There was sort of a parade of dead leaders and all that. But while Andropov was in power, there was this sort of beautiful episode that happened. And again, I don't know if any of you remember this, who are closer to my age. Samantha Smith in 1982 wrote a letter to Andropov, an American 10-year-old. She was my age, and she was scared the same way. She was scared that there would be immediate nuclear war, and she wrote to Andropov asking why does he want it. Weirdly enough, he did get the letter, and he published a reply, but like in a newspaper, did not send her a reply. Then she wrote to a Russian ambassador, like, why he didn't send me a reply? So she got a reply, and moreover, she and her family got invited to the Soviet Union to meet him, to see everything. And here she is in a summer camp, Artek. Artek was a camp in Crimea, which was like the summer camp you were supposed to want to go to. And supposedly you could only get like a pass to go there if you were like the best and most active student. And this was like my childhood dream, to be sent to Artek. And I could never understand why I wasn't. Because I was a good student. I was like active in various things. I was pretty much like the top of what was supposed to be sent to Artek or sent to like various other opportunities, and I never was. And when it was time to join Komsomol, I expected to be among the first people assigned to join, and I wasn't. And only like during like few years after that, when things started falling apart and all that, that's when it dawned on me, oh, anti-Semitism. There was like no other reason that they were giving opportunities to people who were less qualified in that situation. But I did not go to Artek. I got to watch Samantha Smith go to Artek on TV, and it was really cool. This actually started an epidemic of like everybody writing letters to presidents. I wrote a whole poem that I had my teacher translate into English, help me translate into English, that got sent to Reagan. Mr. President, millions of Soviet people tell you no, no to the nuclear war. It was ridiculous. Obviously, like, you know, sometimes they made it, most of the time, of course, they didn't. There was only one Samantha Smith. Unfortunately, she tragically died in a plane crash that many people suspected was staged, but probably not. Just a couple of years later when she was 14. Come on. This does not want to play. Nothing wants to play. This was a peak of my patriotism. This is me at 14. Again, Samantha Smith died in a plane crash at that point. I went to a photo studio, and I had a picture taken of myself in my pioneer tie and my school uniform and my depressed face. and my twisted ankle with a wrap on it, because I was going to join Komsomol. And so I was not going to wear my pioneer tie anymore, and I was sad about it. And those of you who know me, you know that I am a little bit of a pack horse, and I like to keep things and memorabilia. I now cannot stop this music. This is a very patriotic song about how the Lenin is in our heart, and we are just so gung-ho on building communism. I love that song. And these are all various sort of things that you were issued throughout your different stages on progression to building communism. So this is when you were a small child, like first grade, and you were joining the Young October kids, and you were given this baby Lenin thing. And then you joined the Young Pioneers and got this red tie, and you got this. And it says always ready on it. That was like a motto. And then you joined the Union of Komsomol, which is Communist Youth, and you got this, and then eventually you could progress to joining the party, which at some point my grandfather said he will not write me a recommendation because I was too critical of this, because then it was glasnost, and then things started coming out, and I started being less of a believer because the truth was no longer hidden. But other than that, you have like sort of a normal teenagerhood, just slightly less fashionable. Comparatively speaking, this is, I think, 1985. It's me and my friend group at the time. I went on a summer vacation that summer, and I came back, and they declared to me that they were all now fans of these Italian pop musicians, because Soviet television, for the first time ever, allowed the transmission of like foreign music festival, because it was kind of like the sign of all these restrictions. And we were allowed to expose to some reactionary Western cultures that was considered innocent. So pop music in Italy was innocent. I come home and they tell me that they all have crushes on these Italian pop musicians. They all have like picked one, and they saved me one. I had good friends, right? They saved me one. They saved me this one. This is the one they saved me. Now, you guys have seen my husband, though, some of you. They weren't too far off, because apparently I turned out to be into older, bald men in the end, but I certainly wasn't when I was 14. But this is a sample of Italian pop music for you. So it was like, again, kind of like still normal, right? We're like going through life, we're listening to music, we're having crushes on musicians. I refused to have a crush on this musician. And at the same time, there is like this whole anti-nuclear, we want peace. In Russian, the word for word and the word for peace are the same words. So mir means peace to the world. And it's interesting because now Russian invasion, they're doing it under the slogan of Russian world, which also means Russian peace. And none of those things make sense at this point. And of course, this happens. You know what this is, right? So this is what occasioned glasnost, because this is when Gorbachev's already replaced all these old dead people. And he's younger, he's energetic, he's trying to fix things. He's already starting perestroika, which is rebuilding, but he's not bringing out things into the public until Chernobyl blows up. They try to cover it up, but Sweden gets affected, so Sweden outs them. 3 days later, though. So for 3 days, we were not told that this happened. I lived 300 miles pretty much due south. Now, most of the fallout went north, but it went everywhere eventually, right? So we were not told, but this was like in the end, our kind of a watershed moment where Gorbachev decided we're just gonna tell people things. Once they started telling people things, they couldn't stop. Interestingly, this is Chernobyl now. Actually, it's Chernobyl about a week ago. These are Russian encampments here and Russian military vehicles because they took Chernobyl. They dug trenches. So they're all going to die now. That was not super smart of them because that's, radiation is still there to this day. But there are people who used to visit this area. It was like a tourist attraction. You would just be given decontamination suits. If you guys know Mike McLaurin in the library, he went wearing a suit and everything, but these guys were not. Subsequent summer, I got sent to a summer camp near Kherson on the Black Sea. The only way to that summer camp was by a small plane, which is the field here. And this is where I experienced like the first time where I actually shut up and did not get in people's faces and tell them that I was Jewish in the face of anti-Semitism. Because in that summer camp, there were 2 boys in a group of kids here, and we were like all pretty, grown-up kids. That's me. It looks pretty depressing at the time. Where everybody else would gang up on them to the point of like putting burning toilet paper between their toes at night. And, much more persecution, name calling, and things. The difference was that all these people were from Zaporozhye, and I was from Mykolaiv. I was like an exchange student, and I got there a day late. Nobody saw my paperwork. The reason these boys were putting up with it is that they went to school with many of these kids. And they knew that if they made a big stink about it, it would be worse at school. The counselors knew and were covering it up. So, and again, because of how Soviet mail works and how I couldn't get off this island, basically, for a month, I argued with everybody about it and tried to defend them once I found out. And I found out only like in a second week, not right away. But I did not out myself. Because at that point, apparently, I got slightly smarter. So my parents probably felt that they could tell me more things, and they told me more things. And so that's when I found out about the quotas, and I found out about the firings, and I found out about job restrictions and something that was called a disability of the 5th column, or the 5th section. That was a 5th, like things were numbered when you filled out like an application for a passport, say. And number 5 was your nationality or ethnicity. And if you said Jewish, that made you disabled. That made you disqualified for a lot of things like promotions, certain jobs, trips abroad, etc. So that was very limiting in many ways to people. But at that point, I was very keen that I wanted to be a teacher. So I went to like a special pedagogical class in high school where they started teaching me psychology. And that's where, again, I got hit in the face. Well, okay, so you like psychology now? Well, too bad, you can't do it. Because that was only taught at universities, not institutes which were more trained youth-specific profession. And it was not really an option to do that. But then, 1987, right, you have the famous Reagan speech in Berlin where he goes, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall. And people, for some reason, give him credit for the wall coming down. It was 2 years later. Gorbachev didn't care. Pretty much nobody cared at the time. The speech was not popular at the time when he just made it there. Like, people did not really pay attention. And Gorbachev was busy. Gorbachev was busy basically bringing out all the Soviet archives and dragging out all the dirt and making lots of things public and saying, well, we have to do things differently, but we can still build communism. So I'm like, oh, okay, we can tell things now? And I still wanted communism, and I still wanted to build it. And so I was like, okay, we can build it, but we have to fix how we're doing things. So in my school, they had an assembly that happened because the TV people came in. The TV people came in because they wanted to select participants for a TV bridge to talk to other students about self-government of schools. And they started asking us questions about Komsomol, and I get up, and in front of my school principal, the TV people, the whole school pretty much, I tell them that Komsomol is done wrong because we shouldn't have everybody be required to join, and people should only join who want to, and we only should have people who want to actually work towards different goals. And so I basically told them what we have is fake. My homeroom teacher, my actual principal was sitting in front of me, so I did not see her face, but I saw my homeroom teacher across the room, and she was just like, didn't work. I said what I said, and the next day I got called to the principal and I got asked what college I was planning on because it apparently required a gold medal, and she then questioned whether I was going to have one. I was at the time the only person in the school who could have one, so it was very clear to me it was a threat. But I was luckily gotten away with it because the TV people wanted me. So the TV thing happened, and it let me get away with being confrontational, which is, what you guys have to deal with. Me being confrontational because I had that experience of getting away with it. And at this point, a lot more people are coming out and trying to say things publicly, right? And so 87 was an interesting year altogether. 87 is when they finally did sign a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. This was the first attempt to negotiate between Reagan and Gorbachev. Of course, this also happened in 1987. You know who that is? Yeah, Trump and Ivanka Trump, they visited Russia. I mostly have this picture for what Russia looked like. At the time, this is St. Petersburg. So I graduated from high school at this point and went to this pedagogical institute to study mathematics, because I could not go to a university to study psychology. And at this point, I'm still a believer in communism. I'm still really interested in making it happen. But I also am learning a lot about all the things that went wrong in the attempts to build it and how people were forced into things. And I want to fix everything. So I keep getting in trouble with the history of Communist Party professor that was teaching us. But in the end, again, the education was fine. The education was also very structured. You had to all take the same classes. There weren't any of the choices that we have now, which is why it sounds to me like we're trying to make Soviet education here today when we're saying we're going to put students on a path. This was my student group. I'm currently in touch with a lot of these people because I'm scared for them. Because with one exception, they're all in Ukraine and they're all experiencing all that's going on right now. She's in Barcelona, so she's safe. But everybody else pretty much is there, and I think a couple of people actually in Russia, which is a whole another story. So I was this morning talking to this guy here who is now a computer science professor at a different university in town, and his level of stress, given what's going on and recent killings around town and the train station attack that just happened yesterday and all that. This was me doing student theater. This was a Ukrainian play in Ukrainian language we were putting up, but most of the education was in Russian, except mathematical analysis class, which was taught in Ukrainian, which was really weird because I understood it, but I couldn't write it down, so I wrote a translation. And then I had a friend who was from Russia, from Vladivostok. She just recently came, did not know Ukrainian, so she copied my notes. So my friend now complains that they have to teach in Ukrainian, but there are no materials. There are no textbooks in Ukrainian. So the whole transition to Ukraine being Ukraine is made difficult by the history of it not being. So Young Pioneers still exist. I'm going to skip over this pioneer camp. This is the last Congress of Komsomol of Ukraine. Death throes of Komsomol. We did not know at the time it was the last. I got elected from my institute to be a delegate. I'm now feeling like delegate is not the right word in English, is it? Delegate, right? I'm just saying it wrong. The same word. And so me and, I cannot see him right now. There was, this guy. So we are 18 here, and we are sent from the local academic institutions. All these other people are generally older than the age that you are supposed to be in Komsomol. They are functionaries, they're leadership. And once you are leadership, you can stay longer than allowed age. This is my final disillusionment in salvaging Komsomol because I spent time with these people, with these functionaries, and I have learned what they believed in and what they wanted, and none of that was building communism, despite them professing to, and that's kind of how people work. But what's interesting in this picture is, I know it's kind of old and hard to see, that's me. I am holding a flag. So I'm wearing like a blue top and a white skirt, and I'm holding a flag, little flag. This is a red and blue flag of Soviet Ukraine. This was my personal protest at the time. It was always like this. And the personal protest was that Ukraine was at the time pushing towards independence. It was literally months before it becomes independent, right? Ukraine is pushing towards independence, and Ukrainian independence happens with a yellow and blue flag that to me at the time was associated with some very bad history. Very anti-Semitic and anti-Russian history that happened in Ukraine in the early 20th century. So I did not want it at the time, yet here I am. Things change. So another thing that became possible at the time was actually being Jewish and being Jewish in public. And it's a weird thing that happened in Glasnost where you could both be a Jew and an anti-Semite. And I don't mean simultaneously, but like both things were public now. Both things were openly spoken about. There were newspapers that were publishing like anti-Semitic propaganda, and that there were newspapers that were Jewish and talking about Jewish culture. And we had a Jewish school on weekends that I was teaching in. I was teaching history and traditions, secular. We didn't run a religious school. We later on had a rabbi sent, and there was also a religious school. They then got folded together after I left. This is me with some kids from the school at the site of a Holocaust massacre that happened in Ukraine. And because of this school, I got sent in 1991 to Moscow to be, spend 2 weeks in a yeshiva learning from American Jewish school teachers about like curriculum and how to teach certain things and like craft projects and all that. It was all great, except in the middle of this, the communists tried to overthrow Gorbachev. And I'm in Moscow on the outskirts. So the reason for these pictures is that this was very traditional in the Soviet Union. If you woke up and you turned on the TV, and the thing on TV was the Swan Lake, you knew something had happened. Because every time any of those like previous Brezhnev died, Andropov died, Chernenko died, every time that happened, there was a Swan Lake on TV all day, non-stop Swan Lake. So 1991, this t-shirt says 1991 Moscow Swan Lake, kind of commemorative of this event. This was specific Swan Lake production. They always broadcast like the same recording of Swan Lake. This, however, these are Odessa Opera Theater ballerinas performing Swan Lake in front of a military museum in Odessa like 2 weeks ago for Putin. Sort of like, you know, Swan Lake's coming for you. That kind of thing. So the Swan Lake meant that the communists arrested Gorbachev on his dacha when he was in Crimea at the time, but we didn't know. And there was no way to find out where I was. And my cousin was planning to fly to Moscow that day with her son for a medical procedure. And we're all freaking out. We have a teacher who was going to arrive the next day from the States. She was an immigrant, a refugee, and she was coming from Amsterdam. She got scared and turned around and flew back to Chicago and did not come. And so a friend of mine from that program and we decided to go to the center of Moscow, to Central Telegraph, so I can call my cousin, because there was no way to do it from where we were, and find out what's happening. And this is what was happening. At night, it felt like an earthquake. It was weird. So in the morning, we found out it's because the tanks came in on like a central road nearby where we were staying. And then they were in the Red Square, and it looked literally like this, like I was there. It was bizarre. You had tanks in the Red Square. They were not shooting anybody. They were just there. And there were people like walking around and going like, what's happening? There's a parade? Like, what's going on? The soldiers had no idea. They were told to be there. They were also told to like prevent people from going places, but not given specific directions. So we basically climbed over things, and we managed to get to the Central Telegraph anyway. And I called my sister, and she already left. So that did not work out. So then we went around, and we managed to gather enough information to learn that by what was called the White House, that was Yeltsin's residence, he was the president of Russia at the time, people were gathering to basically protect the seat of Russian government and build barricades and all that. So we went and we joined this crowd. So technically, I'm somewhere in this picture. But I can tell you where. You will never be able to see, because my friend and I decided that if there is like a stampede, if there is actual shooting, people will run and trample us. So we picked a tree on this side and we stood like behind the tree so we don't get trampled. But before that, while barricades were still being built, we went and we gathered like whatever things we could find nearby, like pipes and whatever, and we dragged them over to help build the barricades. And so this is some of the barricades actually involved public transportation that were like on the other end of this facility. But that already happened by the time we got there. So there were only small gaps that needed to be closed. We did not need to be doing any of the vandalism like that happened here. So of course, in the end, there was some shooting in this event, and people basically kind of stormed these tanks and stabbed them, and the coup failed. The coup failed, Gorbachev came back, but this was August. By the end of this month, Ukraine declares independence. The Baltic republics already have. And then eventually what you have in September, September is Ukraine declared independence. In December, early December, the president of what's now Belarus got president of Ukraine and president of Russia together in Belovezh Pushcha, it's a forest in Belarus, in a hunting lodge, and they signed the accords that dissolved the Soviet Union. The wording, this phrase, was this guy, Burbulis. He was an assistant to Yeltsin. He was a philosophy major. So for social sciences appreciation. So this phrase, the USSR is a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, sees in his existence. Of course, Putin is now going around and saying this was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. At the time, there were mixed feelings about it. So this is like all of them signed this and signed off on this document. This document gets ratified 2 days later in Belarus and Ukraine, and 4 days later in Russia. And so Russia declares that Soviet Union is no more, because Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were the original signatories in 1922, which gave them the power to dissolve it. This is official. But unofficially, what happened after that point, and this point, well, I think the next 3 years that I was still there, was a big, huge mess. Because, of course, the economy everywhere fell apart. Because the economy was centralized, but it was already falling apart. It was in the process of doing that. And that's the reason that Gorbachev was trying to implement reforms. So a lot of people are blaming Gorbachev for not being like a good leader and letting it all break down. It's not clear what anybody else could have done. He did not want the Soviet Union to fall apart. That we know for sure. Because when they called him from there, the Belarusian leader called him, he was very unhappy and he was like yelling at him. And meanwhile, Kravchuk, the Ukrainian president, was calling Bush. And Gorbachev asked the Belarusian president, what do you think the international community is going to think? And he was hearing the conversation between Kravchuk and Bush, and he's like, oh, they're fine, they like it. They're going to be okay. So Gorbachev was not, because he was still hoping that he could do enough reforms and preserve it. So these countries then formed their own like mini union and tried to rearrange as union of independent countries. That never worked out over time. And of course, both economically and politically, it was just continued to get worse. The problem with being Jewish in that part of the world when things get worse is that somehow it becomes your fault. So, I mean, technically, I guess I participated in the event, so maybe it is my fault, what with the building of the barricades and all. But I certainly didn't feel like, at the time, like the swastikas under my windows and the rocks into the windows which I only accidentally didn't get actually hit by. Like that seemed not quite right. A thing that happened, or the things that the children I was teaching math to were saying about Jewish people did not seem right. Now, they didn't even know I was Jewish, so that was like just generic. So we applied to immigrate, and we managed to came here in 1994 and been here, and I have never been back since. And I sure hope if they win this war to be able to go back. I actually kept wanting to go back to Russia because I have a hobby that involves kind of Russian museums and such. I don't think that's happening. I don't think I want to. I don't think I would be comfortable with it in Russia and dealing with the things that they believe in Russia. But at the same time, this is Ukraine now, and this is a very innocent picture from Ukraine now. This is Kharkiv. It's just people who have been essentially living and sleeping and eating in subways and not been able to come out, especially old people. They can't go back and forth, so there are volunteer organizations bringing them food. I am working with a fundraising and PR organization in San Diego. We just sent $500 to a group that feeds these people in Kharkiv. So I feel like I've done something, especially since most of the money came from me, like making and selling jewelry for fundraising. But it's never going to be feeling like enough because Putin doesn't want to resurrect Soviet Union. He wants to resurrect the Russian Empire. He wants to recreate that map that I started with and to have it all back in Russian power. And very openly in Russian media, they're publishing manifestos basically that are saying that to denazify Ukraine means to completely get rid of everything Ukrainian. So Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian poetry, music, everything, none of that should exist. So I'm not okay with that. That's kind of like what made me more Ukrainian than I ever have been because I happen to really like Ukrainian music. And I like a lot of aspects of Ukrainian culture. And it's not all rosy and pretty. And there is a lot of anti-Semitism even at this point at Ukraine. But if somebody told me in 94 when I left that 30 years later they will elect a Jewish president, I would have never believed it. But it happened. It has changed. It has not happened in Russia. They, in fact, have not actually elected anybody in 20 years. They're just pretending to. So that's kind of like what put me on the side that I am in, despite all this experience. And it's, I think, very useful to understand the context of a lot of people who are involved in all this are people of my generation or an older generation. They all have lived through all of this. And it kind of made them who they are. But it's both people in Ukraine and people in Russia, or their children, who are also exposed to all of this, who are doing this to each other. And it's, I hope it ends. I just do not know how. But this is some context, and thank you for listening. Sorry I went long. The problem with this particular situation is that everybody has heard me rant about this a lot, so I don't know if. Mm-hmm. Yes. There were definitely levels. And it also depended on where you were. Like, there were certain levels in Russia and Ukraine, like in Slavic countries, and there were kind of different levels on stratification elsewhere. You also have to understand that even theoretically, like if you look at the Marxist theory, which I know some of you are familiar with, the idea is like there is like progression of history, right? So you have the feudal culture, and then you have the sort of capitalism, and then from there you get to socialism and so on in that theory. But the Central Asia, they were never capitalist. The culture there was very much, and sort of the life there was very feudal at the point of the Russian Revolution, so they never really quite made progression into capitalism. And they were then kind of forced to skip over and become socialist, and generally they were considered backwards. And they were considered, especially the ones that were still there, like if they moved out and like went to university and all that, but the ones that were there were considered by everybody else backwards, and therefore less qualified for things. There were also always these like ethnic jokes about different cultures. Everybody constantly made jokes about the indigenous populations in Siberia and them being kind of backwards and not knowing things. And the Moldovan people were constantly butt of the joke. Between Russians and Ukrainians, there are always very kind of unpleasant relationships, again, because they started out as the same country and cultures, and they were separated during the Mongolian invasion, and then the Ukraine part has been kind of torn apart all this time. And one time they asked Russians for help, and Russians instead taken over and subjugated them. So there were always bad feelings. So I think to me, like the joke that particularly exemplifies it is an old Ukrainian is dying, and his sons has gathered around him, and they say, "Father, anything we can do for you, anything like your last wish, whatever you want, we will try." And he says, "I would really wish for the Mongols to take over England." And they go, well, "We don't understand, Father, why? Why would you want that? But we will try, but like if we did that, what else would you want?" And he says, "Oh, I would wish for the Mongols to take over England again." "All right, Father, well, let's say we make it happen 2 times, but really, what else would you really want for you? What for you do you want?" And he says, "I wish Mongols to take over England the 3rd time." And they say, "Why, Father? Why would you want it?" And he says, "I'm just imagining them going over Russia back and forth, back and forth." That level of vindictiveness, that level of negativity. It's not, like the Ukrainians are not innocent of not having feelings in the situation, but the feelings are basically because they have been colonized and they have been suppressed, and their language was prohibited from being taught anywhere outside Ukraine, for example. Even if there was a large Ukrainian population, they weren't allowed to have Ukrainian language taught in schools anywhere else. And there were massacres of Ukrainian people. There was Holodomor, which is a famine event that was government instigated that killed a large proportion of Ukrainian population in agricultural area, specifically in eastern Ukraine, where now then they were able to bring in a lot of people from Russia to kind of fill the gaps, which is how you have that whole area, again, also more Russian speaking. So there is just a lot of like history and bad blood. But even if you look at Stalin, despite being Georgian, was very Russophilic. And he very much positioned himself, he changed his name, right? He abandoned his Georgian name, surname, and used the sort of a Russian version. Stalin means one of steel in Russian. And basically promoted Russianness. So that whole Russia is the big brother of everybody, Russia is the leader of everybody, that was promoted. Ukrainians were sort of like a second fiddle, but only if they Russified. So they were like almost Russians. The Baltic people were considered like civilized and qualified, but they weren't trusted because they were a recent addition and they were a little too European. So it was just like all this constant, we're equal, but some are equal, more equal than others. If you look at most recent Eurovision contest, the woman from Russia, Manizha, I believe she actually won. Did she win? No, somebody else won, but she came like pretty high in this context. Her song was Russian Women. She is, I think, from Tajikistan. I'm not going, don't hold me to that, but she is from somewhere in Central Asia, and her family ended up moving to Moscow. So she grew up there, but she's bilingual in those languages and also speaks English now. And there was a lot of hatred directed towards her when she was selected as a nominee to go represent Russia at Eurovision with the song Russian Women, and people were saying, well, she is not Russian, she doesn't get to represent us. Contrast this with Ukraine, where Jamala, who won Eurovision contest several years ago with the song 1944, is Tatar, Crimean Tatar. And the song that she won with was a song about deportation of Crimean Tatars by Stalin in 1944 from Crimea, because they were accused of collaboration with Nazis. But she went to represent Ukraine, and she's considered Ukrainian enough for that, and Ukrainians are proud of her. So it's like a different, the mentality in Ukraine has shifted, where they are like, if you want to be Ukrainian, you are Ukrainian. But in Russia, it's still, there is actual Russians, and then there is everybody else. People, like the actual racism that we think of here, right, that's about skin color, so like not like in the black people, for example, that wasn't a thing in the Soviet Union. It is, unfortunately, now. But in the Soviet Union, it wasn't. It was like people looked at them, I'm sorry to say, like as a novelty, because like where I lived, you never saw one except on TV, right? But you went to Moscow, there would be students from Africa usually that you would encounter, so you would see black people in Kiev, etc. But they were not called black in Russian. They used the NO word, which was like the formal Russian, like in Spanish, like a formal Russian word for that, for being black. Who got called black would be people from certain ethnicities in the Caucasian mountains. Which is the irony, the irony of white people being called Caucasians here. It frankly really gets me, because Caucasian people are not white. Like they don't look white. They don't act, like they're not European the same way, like, you know, other people are, but they get to be called. And so they got called black, and that was an insult. So it was also like a difficult transition when I came here to learn that to say, use an NO word is bad, but to say that somebody is black is perfectly fine. Because I grew up with that being insulting, because you basically label the person by like a specific characteristic, and it was not done. The culture shift had to happen. Interestingly, my grandfather, when he came here, he was convinced that everybody who is white should be able to speak Russian. And the way he decided who is white was weird. For some reason, he thought O.J. Simpson was white. He watched the whole trial. We came during O.J. Simpson trial. He watched the whole trial. He didn't understand English. He decided O.J. was innocent somehow, and also white. And therefore, he could probably talk to him, because he must understand Russian. So he almost got us not get here, because he was a Communist Party member, and he attempted to explain this during an interview in the Moscow embassy. Now, he was a Communist Party member who, during the last years of Stalin, when there were very severe repressions against the Jews, post-creation of Israel, and there was a famous case of the Jewish doctors, and there were lots of repressions against Jewish people in all kinds of like professions where they were kicked out. He was a school principal in a village in Western Ukraine, actually. He got fired, and he got persecuted. And it's only because Stalin conveniently died that he didn't get sent somewhere in the end. But he still he believed that Stalin didn't know. He believed that it's kind of like this mentality of like the person in power is perfectly safe. Right? If Stalin didn't know, it was all his underlings doing wrong, and if Stalin knew it, this wouldn't have happened. And so he still believed, and so when I started being critical of Komsomol, he was like, do you not want to join the party? I was going to write you a recommendation, but you being like that, I'm not going to. He joined during the war. During World War II started, that's when he signed up. Lots of people signed up, and this was part of the outbreak of patriotism. So yeah, it was always level. So if you want like scholarly stuff, one of the links I have there, it has a lot on basically different issues. And there is, of course, like if you look at Astra or Nagorno-Karabakh, depending whom you ask, Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict that's been festering since the 80s. And that had to do with how land got divided kind of arbitrarily. And so basically an ethnic Armenian enclave is part of Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijani people want to keep it, and Armenians want to take it. But also it had mixed population, and then Armenians massacred the Azerbaijani population. And Armenians are now talking about being complete victims in this conflict, especially during things that happened like last year, during the last outbreak of fighting there. And the reality is there are no good guys in that conflict. Like each side basically committed massacres against the other sides and killings. And I keep watching Ukraine and I keep thinking something's gonna come out. Periodically it comes out that like somebody did something to like prisoners of war, but nothing on a large scale, but I'm constantly scared that things will come out that will not look good, because of course war never looks good. And there is all this. There is even more, especially once like Bucha pictures came out. Once you see, like if you've seen the actual, because they post like all these videos straight up online, you can see everything. If you see videos from what happened like today or yesterday, I think it's today in their time still. It was in the morning. So it was night for us when the train station in Kramatorsk got hit. There were 4,000 people at this train station. And so 50 of them are dead, 5 children, and there are like lots and lots of people without arms and legs now that may or may not survive. And you see something like that, and people want revenge. People don't want to forgive. People don't want to be nice. So then you get prisoners of war, and bad things happen, and none of it's going to look good. And so the conversation I had, I don't know if that's still part of it. The conversation I had with my friend, who is a professor, who has to teach in Ukrainian, this morning, because I posted something on Facebook about the thing in Kramatorsk, and the Russians are saying Ukrainians did it. Lots of Russians believe that Ukrainians are doing it to themselves. My aunt, who lives in Voronezh, married to my mother's brother, but she's also my dad's cousin. That's how my parents met, through them. So she is from my hometown, and her family is there, like her nephews, etc. So in a conversation with her last week, my mother generally avoids politics. They don't talk about any of that. They don't bring up anything political. So they're having this conversation, and at the end, my mom decides, they talked about grandchildren, health, whatever. My mom decides I'm going to ask about her relatives if they're okay, because she knew that Nikolaev got shelled. And there were casualties, and there was like several hospitals got hit, and there were other kinds of destruction. So she asks her, how's your nephew? And Nikolaev, and my aunt Larissa goes, why are you asking? And she's like, well, because they got bombed. And she says, what? Bombed. It's no big deal. If anything happens, that's all like Ukrainian Nazis are doing it. And my mom's like, I cannot talk to her because it's not good for my blood pressure. So me being who I am, and because for some reason my aunt has access to Facebook, even though supposedly they don't have it in Russia, but somehow she can see what I post. She doesn't interact, but I know she can see because she told my mother she can. So I went on Messenger and I told her to please not talk to my mother about this, because it's not good for her, even if she wants to believe whatever she wants. So then my uncle called my mother. And my mom's like, we had this emotional conversation. You shouldn't have done that. So what was emotional conversation? So he basically yelled at her that she doesn't know the history of Nazism in Ukraine. So this is where I said, like, these colors, they have some pretty negative associations. Like, there was a reason I was doing this whole protesting back then. The problem with, like, the reason that I am accepting these colors now is because it's very different time and very different use of them at this point. But the history of like the first trying to raise these colors before Soviet Union was created, Ukraine was briefly independent. And so the people who were in charge of Ukraine, some of them were anti-Semitic. And some of them were not. Like the main leadership, Petlura, was actually not. But he was unavailable for a point of time, for a period of time, and somebody else was running the show. And so in his name, multiple like pogroms were committed. But pogroms were committed by both sides. Because as I said, in that part of the world, whenever something difficult is happening, the Jews are always the ones who are getting blamed and beat up. So both the Red Army was doing it and the Ukrainians were doing it. But then when you have like the World War II, Ukrainian nationalists who wanted independence for Ukraine, they took advantage. And they tried to declare independent Ukraine, and they actually tried to work with the Nazis. And to say, we are going to be subject to you, but let us be like our own thing. We like denounce the Soviet Union, and we will be under you, but we'll be Ukraine. Nazis didn't like that, so they arrested like the main guy and kept him in jail. Up until the point where they decided they wanted to use him, but then he fought them and the Russians after that. But again, in the name of like Ukrainian liberation, a lot of Jewish people also got killed. And the Holocaust in Ukraine involved a lot of Ukrainian collaboration. So it was a little weird to me because like last week, Zelensky went to Israel, well, not went to Israel, zoomed to Israel, he doesn't go anywhere. But he talked to Israeli government and he was like, we want you to help us like Ukrainians have, help Jewish people. And yes, there were like, really good people who were helping, but there were a lot of collaborators. And we don't want that. We don't want that kind of help, right? And so people would basically crawl out of Babi Yar and their neighbors would turn them back in and get them killed again. And then people came back to both Ukraine and Poland after the war, and there were pogroms because their neighbors didn't want them to take their homes back because they've taken over. So it was all ugly. And in particular, like in Western Ukraine, there was a period of sort of like lawlessness, like right after the war, where these units, the Bandera followers, they were trying to take control, and they were, well, first trying to attack everybody Jewish, but also everybody connected with Soviet Union, and especially people like school teachers. So my uncle remembers hiding like in a basement with his mother, because she was a teacher, from these Bandera people. And I've been told these stories directly when I went and visited, Western Ukraine when I was older. So I know this happened. I know the history. And the problem is that Ukraine is now, in the last like 10 years, has been looking for heroes of its independence. And the only heroes of independence are these people who did these bad things. So they're still trying to like acknowledge them and celebrate them. And to me, this is like the opposite of what's happening in the United States. Because what are we doing with our heroes of independence? Right, where people are going, well, we don't want, the monument of Jefferson here. He did bad things, so we don't need his monument. We can talk about him as historical figure, but we don't want to name a street for him. We don't want his we do not want like slave owners celebrated, all of that. But in Ukraine, they're now going, well, these people fought for independence of Ukraine. They did bad things in the process, but they did bad things because they basically like had to during this fight. And we wish they didn't, but they're still heroes of Ukraine. So they put up their monuments and they name streets for them, and my uncle has a tantrum. And my college professor friend in Mykolaiv has similar tantrum, and he's like, I don't understand this. Like, how is this okay to name streets and to put monuments and to celebrate these people? And now they're saying we can't have a Pushkin street. Pushkin was like a very famous Russian poet who was actually anti-imperialist and anti-Russian government and spent a lot of time in Ukraine because he got exiled into Ukraine by the Russian government. But no, people are renaming Pushkin streets because they want to disconnect from Russian culture. But Bandera is okay. Who tried to collaborate with Nazis. Now, they sent him to concentration camp for trying. That's also true. But you understand, like, it's a mess. Right? So my uncle's like, well, you don't know the history, and you shouldn't be talking about this, and there is all these Nazis in Ukraine. And I'm like, yeah, There are all these Nazis in Ukraine, they exist. There is anti-Semites in Ukraine, they exist. There are also Nazis in Russian parliament. One just died. There aren't in Ukrainian parliament. There were briefly 2 of them. They didn't get elected again. So, like, who is calling whom a problem here? But even if there were streets named, like over street naming, you're going to go kill children and do what happened in Bucha. Sorry. This is quite outside, and I'm like holding you guys here way longer than necessary. You can just, thanks, Gloria. It's just hard. So I told my mother I will not talk to them at all. And she should not talk. She does not, he's like her only family. So she does not want to get rid of him. But she doesn't want to have any more of these conversations because she gets really upset that he doesn't understand. And he gets upset. And there's all this cognitive dissonance everywhere. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not talking.